So, I think it's safe to say that most people have at least heard of Bertrand Russell, the classical stereotype of a British philosopher and writer. Well-spoken, well-read, intelligent. You get the idea. The same goes for fellow Brit H.G. Wells and the Irish Bernard Shaw. But how many people can say they've heard of Cyril Joad? I would assume you haven't if you're watching this video, but I guess congratulations if you have heard of him. Joad stands as one of Britain's most unknown philosophers when compared to his at-the-time popularity. Even in spite of his status as a household name during the 1930s and 40s, he has practically no legacy and is almost never mentioned among the other philosophical names of his time. He was an utterly prolific writer, having books ranging from every topic between farming and theology to a book entirely dedicated to the criticism of American culture. Joad was known for his popularity and the ability to bring philosophy to the common man, what we might today call a popular philosopher. So what happened? Where did this legacy come from, and more so, where did it go? To quote an episode of the radio show The Brain Trust, which we'll be talking more about later, Joad was a famous philosopher, psychologist, author, journalist, an expert on everything from Plato to poltergeists. Yeah, poltergeists, as in ghosts and paranormal activity. Let's talk about Dr. Cyril Joad. Cyril Edwin Mitchinson Joad came into the world on the 12th of August 1891 in Durham, a town in the north of England not too far from the Scottish border. He wouldn't stay here for long, however, when his family moved to the other end of the country to Southampton due to his father working as a school inspector. From all accounts, Joad's childhood was pretty normal for the son of a relatively well-off family in early 1900s England. He seems to have suffered no real hardship. The only notable information is the strict Christian principles he had instilled into him from his upbringing at home. Attending the Dragon School in Oxford, the same school that more famous faces like Hugh Laurie and Tom Hiddleston would later attend, Joad would eventually go on to Balliol College in 1910, part of Oxford University, to study, as you'd probably expect, philosophy. While Joad started university as a Christian from his upbringing I mentioned earlier, it was around this time he shifted towards a more agnostic approach towards the idea of a creator, instead grasping a rationalist viewpoint where logic and reason reign supreme, believing that human experience trumps divine power. He came to the conclusion that most of the world's evils were social evils, evils such as poverty and famine, were caused as byproducts of economies and capitalism, results of circumstance if you will. As we'll see later though, it wasn't this religious development that was the most important factor to Joad's rocky career. Instead, it was his political and philosophical interests that would be one of the main driving factors throughout his life. Mingling with other intellectuals at Oxford, it was around now that the socialist writings of Bernard Shaw, H.G. Wells and G.D.H. Cole, the theorists behind Guild Socialism, really started to pique Joad's interest. Joining the Fabian Society in 1912, which is still around today and has seen enough famous members that it could be a video of its own, people like Tony Blair, Clement Attlee, and Oswald Mosley, the main driving figure behind fascism in Britain during the 1930s to name a few, were all official members of the society at one point in their life. In 1914, Joad left university and, in his own words, he left as a revolutionary socialist. Seeing the state of the world and deciding it could and would have to be improved through changes to capitalism and economies as a whole, this period was known as the Great Unrest in Britain for a reason. While many in the Fabian Society thought that this should be done gradually with small changes, Joad foresaw the opposite, that violence and class conflict between the rich and the poor would be almost guaranteed. It's interesting to remember that all of this was taking place before World War I and the Second Russian Revolution that came with it. Joad even described in his own 1932 autobiography, Under the Fifth Rib, that many at Oxford held the opinion that to be a Fabian was to be a more advanced member of the university, that membership showed others you were a civilized man for the modern world and its politics. With his presence in left-leaning society, Joad would often find himself on the stage of rallies and strikes, which were both commonplace in the early 1910s, with huge amounts of industrial unrest. This is what hooked him on public speaking. As he describes it, the spectacle of an audience helpless before you is what really kicked the interest in speaking before the masses. Most of the socialist discussion around this time was based around trade unions and the use of direct action, like strikes and active protest, rather than the indirect actions of lobbying and voting in elections, the kind of actions that might lead to the conflict Joad had expected. While socialism was on the rise, the Labour Party was only starting to properly emerge as we know it today. The suffragette Emily Davidson, who'd famously been killed by the King's Horse during the Epsom Derby, had only happened a year before. This was a time where broad types of socialism and social democracy were really starting to find their footing in Britain. Joad had hopped on and was interested to see where it would lead. It was with the start of World War I that Joad's political journey slowly began to gain traction. Becoming a pacifist, less in the I don't want to fight you way and more of war is nothing but pointless mass murder way even before the war had begun, Having this standpoint before the outbreak of the war only pushed him further into the political scene he had already found a home in. Joining the Non-Conscription Fellowship, or NCF, a pretty self-explanatory organisation that opposed conscription of Britain's population, the NCF, which was founded by Clifford Allen and Fenner Brockway, foresaw the fact that in time, a war entirely reliant on those who had volunteered for military service would eventually run out of willing manpower and would need to turn to the rest of the nation to fill the trenches. Conscientious objectors were far from uncommon in Britain at the time, with the NCF and Fellowship for Reconciliation, the former being more political and the latter being more religious, both being born from the Peace Society, which had failed to condemn the war. At one point, over 16,000 Britons, just under 1% of those drafted in Britain, claimed conscientious objector status, though only 350 exemptions from service were given, with almost all of these being Quakers. The majority of these objectors were given alternative non-combat service roles or sent to specialised work camps. Only 1,300 of these 16,000 objectors refused all military service. It's thought that Joad's objection to the war developed from his own hedonistic love of life's pleasures and himself attempted to avoid any suffering where possible, a characteristic he was notorious for later in his life. Writing his first book in 1912 for the Fabian Society about the socialist ideals of Robert Owen, getting married in 1915 and having 3 children, Joad had already begun a budding career through joining the Independent Labour Party, which later dropped the Independent part and renamed themselves to the Labour Party. Continuing to put his skills towards book reviews and journal writing for various left-wing groups, even continuing to dip his toes into the waters of popular philosophy with 2 more books, Common Sense Ethics and Common Sense Theology, both of which try to approach the problems of ethics and theology through Joad's lifelong love of rationalism. It's in 1921 that one of what I can only describe as Joad's less than stellar beliefs crops up. Joad left his wife and, from what information is available, decided that from this point onward that women were inferior to men. It's hard to say if he felt this way before the divorce, or if the divorce was one of the main reasons for this belief. Now, you may be thinking, well, TDW, he probably had some rough emotions from the divorce and was saddened by the fact this would... No, seriously. His biographer noted that Joad had no interest in talking to women unless he could sleep with them, believing their minds lacked objectivity and were generally only suited to be homemakers and housewives. Only to worsen this fact, in his autobiography, Joad admitted, and I quote, "If only women could have remained at the silent film stage, all would have been well, but the invention of talking has been as disastrous in women as it has in the cinema." That's quite a bold statement for a man who would later become one of the most popular philosophers of 1930s and 40s Britain. All of this has quite a comedic level of irony when you consider that in 1907, Joad was a founding member of the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, whose entire aim was to bring women the same voting power as men. For a bit of additional context, the Women's Social and Political Union was the main suffrage organisation at the time, but this was only limited to female membership, meaning men had to form their own organisations. Joad even spent a night in jail for breaking windows in Oxford Street over the matter, though almost all of this positivity for his activism in the name of women vanishes when you find out why he was into this activism. Once again, from his autobiography, he admitted that he, ever the hedonist, had found a great pleasure in mixing with cool cigarette-smoking, Russian tea-drinking, trouser-wearing feminists who loved talking about sex. All these less than desirable opinions on women culminated in his expulsion from the Fabian Society in 1925, but it wasn't his belief in the lacking intelligence of women, but instead his philandering with the society's female members. You can't help but be even slightly impressed, for all the wrong reasons might I add, that a man who considered women to be inferior could be so successful in courting them that the political organisation he was a part of had him expelled. The 1930s is where Joad's life and career really start to come into their own, mostly due to the release of a sequel to World War I in the form of World War II, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Maintaining his interest in politics, he went on to become the head of philosophy at Birkbeck College, part of the University of London. Now, you remember that brief mention of Oswald Mosley and his membership in the Fabian Society? You do? Good. Because in 1930, Mosley wrote up an expanded version, the first version was rejected by the Labour Party, of what's referred to as the Mosley Memorandum. This was basically a document outlining economic changes to be made that would help deal with unemployment, a huge issue at the time. While the finer details aren't super important to Joad's story, plans suggesting massive investment into housing to create jobs and implementing measures to protect the British Empire's economy proved to be popular among members of the Labour Party. Politicians like Oliver Baldwin, the son of Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, Aneurin Bevan, who would go on to play a key role in the founding of the NHS, and A.J. Cook, the hugely influential General Secretary of the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, all signed the memorandum in support. With the failure of the second memorandum, Mosley quit the Labour Party. Joining this new party, Joad hung around for a couple of years before, in 1932, mostly met with Mussolini and decided that fascism and militarism were the new hotness, much to the disgust of Joad, along with John Strachey. Strachey? Anyway, another Labour Party member who would go on to join the Communist Party of Great Britain. After this awkward encounter with the soon-to-be fascist, Joad doubled down in his absolute pacifism and committed to the anti-war movement entirely after the Labour Party faced a bit of an identity crisis. The party had to decide if socialism was more important to them or pacifism, as it was expected the first wouldn't be obtained without a violent revolution. 1933 rolls around and Mr. Mustache in Germany has just become Chancellor. At this time, support for the King and Empire was still pretty high in England, but with the supposed war to end all wars only a decade and a half earlier, pacifism and opposition to war often came into conflict with these ideals of a grand empire. It's hard to maintain an empire if you don't want to fight over it. This general sentiment resulted in the now famous King and Country debate, named after the propaganda that was published during World War I to fight for King and Country, taking place at the Oxford Union. This was the university's debating society, considered to be one of the world's most influential and exclusive university societies, and who would be one of the stars of the show other than our very own Cyril Joad? The full motion, that this house under no circumstances fight for its king and country, proposed the idea that, during a war, the Oxford Union would support or oppose the conflict. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of info regarding the actual contents of Joad's speech, mostly just small snippets remembered by those who were there to witness it. The society wouldn't record the contents of speeches, instead choosing to record the debate taking place and its chairman, the speakers on each side for and against, who proposed the particular debate and the outcome of it. We can, however, gather enough information to understand that Joad kind of rocked the house with his speech. A few sources mention Joad's speech as eloquent and comment on his iconoclastic temperament and emotional pacifism, and even suggest that he may have had the single biggest contribution to the outcome of the debate in favour of pacifism. He began his speech in the falsetto voice he had become known for at this time. On a side note, I'd really recommend you find a video of Joad speaking because it's not what you'd expect. Recounting the famous story of Lytton Strachey, not to be confused with John Strachey from earlier. Lytton Strachey, another famous conscientious objector during the First World War, had claimed, in the case of a German soldier going after his sister, he would simply try to come between them. Joad went on to state that Strachey's voice had been high-pitched as a result of psychological reasons, much to the enjoyment of the audience. Joad then switched gears to a more serious tone, explaining how his best friend was left screaming in agony as he slowly died on barbed wire for 24 hours during the First World War. He even seemed to sort of predict the atom bomb a full 12 years before its first use in Hiroshima, claiming that another war would bring, quote, a single bomb from an airplane that would poison every living thing within an area 3/4 of a square mile. With all this flair for dramatic delivery and comedic commentary, his speech was considered overwhelmingly important to the outcome by those in attendance. The result? The motion was passed 275 votes to 153, a majority of 122. That's no small feat for a society filled with some of the nation's most aristocratic intellectuals. I wouldn't doubt that this boosted his ego a fair bit, as he later wrote in his 1937 book, The Testament of Joad, and naming a book like that is a pretty boastful move to begin with, I'm intellectually sympathetic, and can enter the minds of the young. I can teach anything to anybody. A pretty bold statement if you ask me. The media's response was not one of praise, however, with the Daily Mail calling it an ignoble resolution, and the Daily Telegraph printing, "Disloyalty at Oxford, gesture towards the Reds." This overwhelming support of anti-war rhetoric against the idea of fighting for king and country, something that was sort of seen as a patriotic duty at the time, was poorly received by many. It was perceived as a group of young people denouncing the legacy of veterans and casualties of the First World War, all 886,000 of them. The future Prime Minister Winston Churchill called the outcome abject, squalid and shameless. This was only exacerbated by the fact that this extremely prestigious group at one of the most famous universities in the world was seen as the next generation of politicians and national icons. What did it say about the future if they refused to fight for their country? The outcome of the debate was significant enough that the Oxford Pledge, as it became known, acted as somewhat of a rallying cry for pacifists across the world. And now, at long last, we come to World War II. The era where Joad's popularity skyrocketed from being a well-known lecturer to a household name across Britain. From 1930 to 1940, he had gone on a bit of a spree, writing around 9 books in this time frame, mostly centred around philosophy and its concepts, though some dealt with topics of religion and the history of civilizations. Though the creatively named The Story of Civilization, written in 1931, was a tiny 94 pages long. For reference, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells, which is a much simpler story compared to discussing the history of civilization, is 84 pages long. The book covers chapters such as the spreading of knowledge, the sharing of money, and Greece and the making of beautiful things, basically a brief account of how humans managed to make it this far in history. But this short length is kind of what made the books appealing. People who didn't know anything about philosophy could pick up one of these books and read it in a few days. You weren't going to read one of these books and be able to go one-on-one with Plato and Aristotle, but you'd definitely see the world in a different way. At this point, with the kickoff of World War II and the end of the Spanish Civil War, Joad had actually renounced his pacifism. This was done in response to how the British and French governments had both allowed Germany and Italy to support the Franquist regime in Spain, with little intervention from Western powers to counteract these efforts. Almost all foreign support for the Republican and Socialist factions came from foreign volunteers, perhaps most famously George Orwell, who wrote about his experiences in his book, A March to Catalonia. Joad had decided that doing nothing to stop wars was worse than contributing to them. Now, with the war in full swing, Joad had moved on and attempted to offer his services and status to the Ministry of Information, the governmental department responsible for wartime propaganda and publicity. Despite his best efforts, however, he was turned down. But not too long after, in 1941, Joad was selected to be on The Brain Trust, a radio show made up of a panel of 5 experts from varying fields, answering questions sent in weekly by the public. These questions varied from why not abolish the motor car after the war, sent in during a 1945 airing, as cycling had boomed in popularity due to fuel rationing and halted production of private vehicles, to how can the captain of a ship tell his position in thick fog in mid-ocean? The show proved to be incredibly popular, with more than 4,000 letters a week, and almost a third of the UK's population tuning in to listen to Joad's soon-to-be catchphrase of, well, it all depends on what you mean by. Though this radio show wasn't well received by everyone, conservatives often took issue with Joad's socialist and left-leaning viewpoints and answers. The threat and fear of communism was already something people were starting to consider, and a strong support for the Soviet Union didn't help Joad's position in the eyes of the conservative elements of the nation. The Brain Trust had effectively turned Joad into a national celebrity. Regardless of how interested you were in philosophy, you knew the name Cyril Joad. While he was known and enjoyed by huge amounts of the British population, his relationship with fellow philosophers was far from good with most. Even Bertrand Russell, a man that had had a huge influence on Joad, seeing him as a plagiarist, with many more grimacing at the fact he referred to himself as Dr. Joad, despite never receiving the official title from any university. Though somewhat surprisingly, he was aware of his own unoriginality when it came to his philosophy, himself denying the idea that he was an original philosopher and instead seeing his own beliefs as eclectic rather than systematic. He mixed the viewpoints of multiple thinkers like Russell, Plato, Bergson, and he knew it. Now, if you think back to the start of the video, I may have glossed over one of Joad's most interesting beliefs. An expert on everything from Plato to poltergeists. Yeah, that's right, Joad. A man committed to rationalism and the understanding the world through logic and reason, believed in a spiritual world interlinked with our own physical world. It may surprise you to hear that spiritualism and psychical research was a wildly common interest during the later 1920s and 30s, with whole associations and colleges being founded to study the supposed spiritual world. The London Spiritualist Alliance, founded in 1883, being one such example, with the bonus fun fact that Arthur Conan Doyle, the author behind Sherlock Holmes, became its president in 1925. These colleges conducted research through seances attempting to communicate with the spirits and investigations into reported phenomena. One such example, Helen Duncan, claimed to be able to produce ectoplasm during seances as a result of summoning spirits of those recently deceased. Though, upon further investigation, it was found to be cheesecloth covered in egg whites, and the spirits, they were papier-mâché masks over old sheets. While Joad had mixed views on people like Helen Duncan and her supposed ectoplasm, he continued to have a strong idea of a psychic factor and the existence of a timeless soul that would persist after death. This belief in paranormal activity stemmed from the idea that strange occurrences were a result of unknown factors beyond science at the time, rather than a belief in what you might call traditional psychic stuff, like telepathy or seeing the future. This isn't to say that he thought telepathy was impossible, just that it was much rarer. Going back a bit to 1932, Joad and Harry Price, a well-known paranormal investigator and ghost hunter, teamed up to attempt a pretty bold experiment. They were going to turn a goat into a boy. The plans came from an old German manuscript titled The High German Black Book, and claimed that at midnight on top of the Brocken, a mountain that I'm probably mispronouncing the name of, to the southeast of Hanover, with appropriate preparation, a goat could be transfigured into a human child. Now, the actual instructions are very long and very wordy, and I won't be reading the whole thing here because there's bits of Latin I don't even know how to pronounce in it, but some of them include drawing some big runes on the ground, turning the goat around 3 times, and pouring a jug of wine over the head of the goat. Pretty occulty as you'd probably expect from German black magic. After all these preparations, chanting, the lighting of fires and incense, the goat was still a goat. But this was actually the result Price wanted. You see, the belief in these rituals and magic was still pretty common among the residents of the Harz Mountains. Price wanted to prove that these rituals were actually nonsense. While this single experiment wasn't going to instantly make the local population drop their faith in magic, Price knew that holding these big public experiments was going to be an important step in dispelling the belief in what he thought was a bit silly. Though he did genuinely endorse some mediums he thought to be truthfully communicating with spirits. The 42 photographers, 73 journalists, and a talkie set up for recording the event definitely helped with spreading the word about the experiment. Another interest of Joad's, which I couldn't find a good segue to discuss, was his love of nature and hatred of overdevelopment. Being an active hockey player and enjoying country walks, he was well aware of the environmental implications of things such as tourism and industrial exploitation, even writing a book on the matter in 1946 titled The Untutored Townsman Invasion of the Country. The book, as you might expect, was a guide on how individuals should be visiting the countryside and green places, both for mental and spiritual health, but was intended to teach them how to behave when visiting. This sounds pretty mild, don't destroy nature when you visit, but his environmental beliefs actually went much further than this. He detested cars. In one episode of The Brain Trust, he stated how he hoped that, because of how car use had dropped massively during the war, it would never recover and cars would fade out, claiming the internal combustion engine had been a complete disaster for humanity. He encouraged environmental actions like the use of public transport and, somewhat radically for the time, organic farming. Though his encouragement of organicism wasn't as extreme as people like Rolf Gardner and Jorian Jenks, incredible name by the way, who, without spending an entire video's worth of time on the matter, were both neck deep in organic soil with a heavy dose of fascism thrown in. So Cyril Joad, the now famous popular philosopher, ghost hunter, and all-around interesting man, was at the peak of his career, selling books like hotcakes, giving speeches and lectures. Seemed like all he had to do was enjoy his popularity and retire. But no. Let's set the scene. It's 1948. You're Cyril Joad. You're on a train. And what's this? Here comes the ticket inspector. But you're Cyril Joad. You don't need a ticket. In his own words, you cheat the rail company wherever you can. When asked to present his ticket, Joad claimed he couldn't find it, and somewhat expectedly was given the whopping fine of £2, roughly the same as £65 today, around $85 US. This single fine made front-page news and was an utter catastrophe for Joad's career. Despite his claims that it was all one big misunderstanding, with his solicitor explaining that it was the responsibility of his secretary to get the tickets from him, with Joad saying no ticket was needed as he already had half a return for the journey, which he then couldn't find. Almost instantly, the BBC had him rejected from the final broadcast of the Brain Trust, the very radio show that had shot him into national prominence. He lost all hope of a peerage, basically a fancy title which covers categories like Duke, Earl, Baron, etc. His health rapidly deteriorated after this incident, being confined to his bed in his Hampstead home, returning to the Christianity from his upbringing and renouncing his agnosticism in 1952 along with the publishing of his final book, The Recovery of Belief, which actually further soured his relationship with some of his humanist friends. Eventually, Joad died of cancer in his home in 1953 at the age of 61. So, that's the story of Cyril Joad, from socialist pacifist to socialist philosopher to socialist celebrity. And so I hear you ask, what's the moral of the story? What should we learn? The lesson? Don't fuck with the National Rail. They'll put you in the ground. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you really did enjoy it, then consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel for more of this kind of thing. If there's any groups or people you'd like to see a video on, then let me know in the comments, and other than that, see ya!